Hey guys, this is Professor Kirin Taylor, and I'm here today with Milena Castillo-Grynberg. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Milena, and I graduated recently from the University of Southern California with a bachelor's in science in environmental studies. Um, I've done some research work with the Wrigley Institute, um, some on the Kelp Biofuel Project, which is pretty cool. You should check it out on Wrigley's website if you get the chance. And also, I have some background working with environmentally centered startups. I did some work with Imperfect Produce and more recently with a company called BeFlow that kind of focuses on working with natural processes instead of against them to create a vision for more sustainable agriculture. And they're specifically working with bees. And yeah, just in general, we read a lot, care a lot about environmental issues. So that is where I'm coming from.
So to give you guys some background, Milena and I met when we were pretty young, I think around 11.
Yeah.
And since that point, we've worked together on various projects and kind of initiatives, including with the peace education stuff that I've talked about previously in my lectures at Little Friends for Peace. And part of that was also trying to bring in this environmental component that Milena was really passionate about even years ago before college. So like working with recyclable art and trying to bring in some concept to children of considering the environment in their conceptions of peace. And so that's been kind of an interesting part of some things we've done together in the past. And for me, as someone who's teaching in political science and also doing research and advocacy for people who are experiencing homelessness, the aspect of the environment is something that's been really pressing on my heart recently because it's just so dire a world situation, to be frank. And so I've asked Milena to come into our class today to kind of share a little bit more about what is the climate reality and maybe some current events. And we're also going to discuss an article that we'll get into in a little bit. But do you have anything to add at this moment?
No, just, I mean, I took a couple classes in college that kind of were an intersection between international relations and politics and the environment. And I would say those were like among my favorite classes I took in university because I think it's a very important mix of issues to consider. Um, I mean, with globalization, we're like so connected, and because the environmental issue is like an issue that's going to affect obviously every country, and it's not like you can, draw boundaries. And so it's going to require like an unprecedented degree of collaboration. So I think it's really important to consider like politics and how to address the climate crisis through them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So I guess, okay, well, I wanted to talk about, so when Kirin asked if I would be interested in guest lecturing, I was like, yes, of course, without thinking about it, because I love Kirin. And because I like talking about environmental issues. And the first thing that came to mind, I guess, was this article that my friend recently shared with me. It was published in The Believer magazine, and it's called Under the Weather. And I'm sure Kieran will provide a link to it in some way. But the article really struck me because it explores a lot of different dimensions of the emotional impact of climate change, and I thought it was very raw and very real. How it talks about how sort of the inability to articulate our feelings about climate change and the things we know to be true about climate change affect us, and kind of our suppression as a result of the lack of tools that we have, the lack of vocabulary that we have to discuss this problem, like affects our ability to really confront not only like what we're feeling within us, but then also, as a larger group, to confront the full extent of the climate crisis. Because if we can't acknowledge it to its like full degree, if we don't have the words to like really express the like specificities of what's going on and also of what we're feeling about it, then it's going to be difficult to find solutions that like really fit the problem at hand. So basically, at one point in the article, it talks about, and I thought this would be an important place to start. It mentions the Permian extinction, which is basically an event that happened like an extremely long time ago. Basically, because of a volcanic eruption, you know, carbon levels in the atmosphere got very high, and like in a very, very short span of time, 96% of the animals on Earth went extinct. Insects were almost completely wiped out, and it took millions and millions and millions of years to kind of start the recovery process from that. And the person writing the article, the main person whose story we follow, was like very concerned about this specifically because she finds out that for now, in the first time in history since that point, carbon levels in the atmosphere are reaching like similar levels. So we're facing the possibility of another mass extinction, and there's already been a lot of articles coming out about, you know, the insect apocalypse, about how many species we're losing. I mean, the red list grows every day more and more, the list of endangered species. Like everyone's talking about how we're basically undeniably going to lose them, just like the Great Barrier Reef. People are talking about how the Amazon is burning. So it's like we're being faced with the threat of like a large extinction. And then, I mean, ultimately, then we turn that question back to ourselves as humanity. Like, what is our future going to look like? How are we going to survive this? How many of us are going to survive this? And how are we going to survive this?
Can I pause really quickly to say something really important in the language you're using is talking about this as like not just climate change, but a climate crisis. And I think that's really important for people who are representing this this issue politically to know that it is in fact a crisis, that we're at a turning point where things either, you know, are intervened and start going up, or they go kind of drastically down. And if you look at the definition of crisis, that's pretty much what that term means. And I believe we talked about it in our comparative politics class before, because certain things are now being termed a crisis, and that changes the way that different political actors might prioritize them within their political agendas or legislation, for example.
Oh, exactly. I mean, that's like kind of one of the points the article makes. It's like even minor changes in vocabulary, right? Like language is very political because it kind of defines what exists. I mean, it affects our conceptualization of reality. And I think even like small changes like that have been resisted though for so long. Like truly addressing it as a climate crisis, you always try to like soften the language. I feel like for so long people have been trying to kind of soften the language of environmental destruction that we're seeing, because they don't want to alarm people. Because I mean, I don't know, when you hear crisis, it's like blaring red alarms in your head. Like that's something super scary. And it is something super scary. And I mean, we should call it what it is. But I think, like, you know, the person who writes this article, and also something that I felt personally a lot, is like kind of like walking the line of trying to figure out how real you can be about a problem when you're talking about it without totally losing people. Because if you make it seem like this unsolvable thing that's just like, you know, we're all going to die, the world's going to crash and burn, people will just check out. Because it's like, I don't know, I mean, how do you live with that? How do you even begin to process that kind of reality? Like that kind of thing is so massive. But then at the same time, you don't want to downplay the problem, and you don't want to ignore what you know to be true, because I mean, that just means that you're basically like blindfolding yourself as you're going over a waterfall. I mean, ignoring the problem isn't going to work either. So you kind of, I don't know. I mean, I still haven't found that sweet spot, I guess. But that's pretty much what this article explores, among other things.
Yeah. This article, which I only heard of from Milena, is really interesting, and it begins with kind of someone's personal experience who became very depressed and started to live his life in an alternative way because of his awareness of environmental issues. And I want to share a little piece from it by sharing the screen, because from what you just talked about, this is particularly relevant. If you see here, it says, his father and sister blamed his breakdown on abuse that he suffered as a child. And I'm kind of just summarizing a little bit. But he thinks it was something different. When he was 15, his father had taken him and his sister on a trip to Mount St. Helens. Halfway up the mountain, they had passed clear-cut land. As Chris recalls, one moment there was only evergreen forest, and the next moment there was nothing, just bare ground and stumps as far as he could see. A word came to his mind, evil. From that day forward, something shifted in him. He didn't want any part of such destruction. By his senior year in college, this conviction had grown into a personal mandate to renounce participation in human society altogether. He was offended by his family's attempts to find explanations in his psychology for problems he thought of as external to him. Why does my grief have to be because something bad happened to me? He told me. They made it sound like I had a psychosis or a mental breakdown, and that this is just the form it took, when really, shouldn't anyone who is ethical and compassionate also choose to opt out of society?
Yeah. So I think like this article really explores the phenomenon that we're seeing now of just a massive rise in mental health, in mental health issues, I guess. But because of climate change, right? Among other issues, just seeing all the terrible things that are happening in the world is causing depression, anxiety, etc. in a lot of people, even though maybe they haven't personally experienced it, which is something unique. But also, they take it a step further because they talk about, whether this is really something that we want to classify as mental illness because of the implication that the sickness is internal versus external. They talk about, if the cause of sickness in an individual is the sickness in society, then shouldn't the healing of society be a part of healing the individual? Which I think is definitely true, because otherwise it kind of feels like the solution, I guess, to not being depressed or anxious about climate change is basically to cultivate a sort of willful ignorance of the things you know to be true, to kind of push that to the back of your mind and try not to think about it, because otherwise you just can't function and it becomes impossible to cope. And the guy you just talked about in the article, Chris, he does sort of end up doing that to an extent. Eventually, the protagonist in this article, I guess, whoever's writing it, later meets up with him, and he's gotten married and he lives in a house with a big green lawn, and he's had children. And he talks about how he was sad for so long, and it just became unbearable. So to a degree, he knew that the life that he had chosen wasn't true to his beliefs, and to a certain degree, he did have to have sort of this cognitive dissonance just to go on. But at the same time, it doesn't completely go away, because I don't know, he was still talking about how he would have these visions sometimes at night with trouble sleeping. He'd have nightmares or visions of massive wildfires, or just refugees and stuff like that. So I think that suppression, and I think that definitely goes to show that just full-on suppression is definitely not the solution.
Right. And meanwhile, this willful ignorance part can only happen to select groups of people who aren't directly in the line of climate change, or who are having other privileges that help them to not directly feel those effects, or to be able to ignore it. And so this is something we've talked about in our class as well, like the difference in contribution to climate change and the climate debt between the global north and the global south, as well as just between different social economic classes and the different ways people live their lives, with all of us being a political actor in that sense.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. I mean, even having the option to, like, go away and get a house with an ice cream lawn is not an option to, like, a lot of people in the world, particularly people in the global south. And it is hard because, in asking someone to acknowledge the full extent of climate change, there are different degrees to which an individual can make a difference. And like you said, I mean, the people who are being affected most really have the least say and the least ability to change their circumstances and what's going on. So I think that's something really difficult to, I guess, come to terms with or find a way to make peace with. And I think that having language to talk about that and just having that specific aspect of climate inequality, of like environmental injustice. I mean, just having those topics and those themes more present in environmental conversations is really important. I think that's that's the point of the article, and the point that, like, in my major, our professors always told us that the biggest problems the biggest problem that a lot of them saw with the environmental crisis isn't that we didn't have the information, but that a lot of scientists, a lot of experts just don't know how to communicate the information that they have to the public. That, like, it's not that we don't have solutions. It's not that we don't have the research. It's just like, how do we fix the disconnect that exists between, like, that and then the public and, like, people who are like policymakers. What's missing is communication, is like the proper language, and then also the stuff that we're talking about with the language that we already have. It's like, the difference between climate change versus climate crisis, the difference between talking about climate change as if it were like a problem that we're all equal players in versus a problem that certain countries in the world, obviously, like, the United States, wealthier countries, the global north, if you will, have, like, massively exacerbated, while the global south has been more of just like a casualty in the whole thing.
Speaking of language, I have to say I really hate this distinction of global north, global south too, because I feel like it makes it so vague to what you're actually talking about. Even within the global north, there's a select few countries that still within that group have a disproportionate impact and have policies and just societal norms, and that I would say are perpetuating this issue considerably. So I always kind of have trouble with that sort of terminology. And
Totally.
yeah.
I think, like, the vaguer the term, I mean, it's just another, like, you're purposely kind of obscuring it, right? Like, I think that what you want to aim for is terminology that, like, elicits just, like, the rawest, most clear image of what you're talking about, right? In the article, I think they even mentioned, like, like, at the time that PTSD became, like, just a ton of people were getting diagnosed, this guy was like, why don't we just call it being fucked up by war? Because that's what it is. It's like, I mean, it's like obscuring it really takes away the, like, emotionality of it, and the emotionality is what we need, because I mean, that's what drives action and understanding. Otherwise, if we're trying to, like, make it all academic, rationalize it, I mean, first of all, that is already going to obstruct communication to a certain point, because you can only communicate with people who, like, understand that level of academic language and have had, like, the level of education where they can learn to have those dialogues. And also, like, additionally, it's just like, even in the people who are using the terminology, it's like you become removed from it. And yeah, I think as simply and as directly as we can address issues like climate change, homelessness, I don't know, I think that's where like real solutions are going to start coming out.
Do you mind if I point out a couple more things in the article?
No, please go ahead.
Okay, let me share the screen again. Our class has talked a lot about Puerto Rico and its relationship to the United States as neo-colonial. And here in again, talking about PTSD, they talk about how there was a 7% spike in PTSD among the children who survived Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And this kind of also is getting into how it's not just climate change or the climate crisis that's the issue, but also the governmental responses to disasters and ways that you can mitigate disasters through things like strong infrastructure and preparation when you know something is coming by taking certain precautions. But it just, to me, that's one of the most frustrating parts of this sort of discussion is really like when we're discussing how we can move forward and what we can do, it's hard to have that conversation without, in this case, when we talk about Puerto Rico, talking about the US. And it can't fall to Puerto Rico without falling to a greater extent to the US if they're still going to have that affiliation as a Commonwealth status. So you guys have heard me, at least my class has heard me talk about Puerto Rico enough to know my stance on that. But this is another thing with the emotional and psychological tolls that environmental disasters take. We have to really consider, is the government doing enough to mitigate those effects on their citizens? Because there is also an extent to which, since there's a lack of control or less control for some political actors, all political actors are still supposed to meet human rights. And I'm speaking here about nations are supposed to meet human rights. And so part of that is protections for people, and that also includes mitigating and responding adequately to things like climate processes and climate.
Definitely. Well, like you said, I mean, the first step, and even in that even being a possibility, is for those things to be, for that terminology to exist and be recognized and be included, right? Because it's like, if first you have to recognize things like eco-anxiety or PTSD caused by natural disasters as things that have happened and are going to happen. And there's still a lot of debate. I mean, a lot of people recognize studies that increased exposure to like nature, improves people's moods and can relieve symptoms of depression, anxiety, PTSD, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But they are still kind of skeptical about the opposite, which is that lack of interaction with nature, or especially thinking about witnessing things having to do with the climate catastrophe, can worsen depression or cause anxiety, PTSD, etc. So I think a recognition of that is the first step. And I mean, they list a whole ton of examples in the article of people struggling with that. I mean, they talk about Greta Thunberg and like how she's openly talked about having a really long period of basically crippling depression after realizing the full extent of climate change and seeing people's inaction. And they talk about how suicide rates for farmers in India is huge. I mean, because there's drought, rising temperatures, and that's destroying land, and so farmers are basically going broke and taking their lives. And I don't know, I still think we don't really have a word for that, and so I think that it's hard for policymakers and more so for even people themselves to recognize the symptoms of those things in themselves. And I think that does make you feel a little bit crazy if it feels like a foreign concept to you. You're like, I'm feeling all these things, but I don't really have a reason to. And if you haven't heard of anyone else that has, and you don't know about the phenomenon, then I think that makes you feel super, super lonely. And I mean, you're not gonna talk about it either because, I don't know, because it's depressing, and also because you're scared people won't really get where you're coming from, and you probably like feel a little bit like crazy yourself. So I don't know. I think like these kinds of this kind of terminology, I would like to see them in like all the way up from like large scale international conversations about climate change down to like, I don't know, if you could just go to your therapist like one on one for them to have this kind of vocabulary and be aware of these kinds of phenomena.
Mm. That's a great point, just about the scale of where and how we need to change how this issue is framed. And also one of the key strategies named within this article, which just we're definitely going to link it to everyone who's listening to this conversation. But the key strategy they suggest is to name these emotions and to normalize them, because I think there are a lot of people also who become turned off to their emotions, again, like with the willful ignorance or choosing to pursue and focus on other things, while undoubtedly these issues affect all of us, whether indirectly or directly. At least we have some sort of personal output of our relationship to the natural environment and to other people around us. And so I see in the article too something I thought was worth pointing out, which is that in the United States, a group of 21 young people filed a lawsuit called Juliana versus United States that argues that the government's inaction on climate change will cause psychological damage to future generations. And it notes here as well, disappointingly, that the Trump administration has fought the suit at every step, and it is currently on hold. So,
yeah, well, see, that is something very important to acknowledge that that's happening. And then I think on the flip side of that, also the article talks about not to like force a positive twist on it, because they do warn against that. But I mean, they also talk about people who are seeing this problem and are already taking action. Specifically, I found it really interesting. They were talking about the Bureau of Linguistical Reality that's based in San Francisco, and it was basically founded by two people who saw the lack of vocabulary that we had and thought that it would be a really unique way to engage with people. Basically, they saw that classic environmental activism strategies kind of, I mean, not saying this is what all environmental activists do, but kind of trying to either talk to people that already agree with you or like yell at people that wasn't really yielding the results that they wanted. And so they thought that, I don't know, creating an organization about language of climate change, and in that way just trying to engage with people by just posting up somewhere with a table and having posters up with the names of words that they invented, and kind of talking to passersby or trying to engage with people, being like, hey, we need a definition, a word for like this specific definition, this specific feeling. And in that way it was like much more collaborative, and people were kind of curious because it was a little bit strange. And so I thought that their approach was super cool. I I'm gonna share my screen because I want to point out the specific part in the article.
yeah, please.
So right here, they talk about how when they debuted the Bureau of Linguistical Reality at the Paris climate meetings. They say a woman from Haiti approached her almost in tears. The fact that other people were talking about feelings of grief, the woman said, made her feel less isolated and crazy. An environmental lawyer came by later to look for a place to sit. When he learned what the Bureau does, he confessed to Quante that his job weighed on him heavily. Every day, he told her, he went to court to fight against environmental destruction. But as a lawyer, his only tools of expression were the languages of rationality and law. He could never say what he actually felt. As he spoke to Quante, he began to cry. No one has ever asked me what I felt about this before, he said. And then she talks about suppression. I mean, despite the fact that there's like mounting evidence that people all around the world are feeling this from all like different backgrounds, it's something that people still aren't talking to each other about or even acknowledging to themselves. And so I thought that this was really powerful imagery of just people seeing their stand and learning about this at a conference was enough to bring multiple people to tears, just because it was something that maybe like a second ago they were feeling fine, but just seeing that just kind of broke the dam within them and like brought out all of these feelings that they were suppressing just because they didn't think that there was an outlet for them. So yeah.
I love that you highlighted that section, because as I've been engaged in international politics, there's so many great humanizing moments where people connect on this sort of issue, and they're like, oh, you care about it too, you know, we're out here kind of struggling with the lack of recognition of certain really important and really detrimental things happening in the world.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think that's an important first step, is kind of just like being able to recognize how you feel and being comfortable enough to just sit in the discomfort of it, like being like, wow, our world is kind of shitty right now, and there's a lot of really bad stuff going on, and I feel really bad about it. And whatever else you feel, like I feel guilty for feeling bad about it because other people have it worse. Whatever it is you're feeling, laying it out and being able to like really like sit with it and explore it, first with yourself and then like ideally with other people too, that you can connect with other people about it, hear how they're feeling, hear about their specific experiences. And I think that openness is, if anything, is going to open up paths to like to solutions. But I think first you have to be willing to feel really bad because if you don't, you're never going to be able to find a real solution, because you're not going to be able to acknowledge these problems for what they are.
No, I think that's very valid. And I can say, like, on a personal note, like, for you being my friend and for me being in this political sphere, it's so good to have you in that position and like to be kind of pushing me against my comfort zone on this issue, because it is so sad and it is so like urgent as well. So I think, yeah, like if we can all kind of like realize and comprehend the reality, aware that we can then like act, and the more people who come on board with this, we can then act. And I'm not someone who thinks that just because it's looking bad right now that it can't be positive, because I do have that positive spin on my political view, at least.
Definitely. And I mean, that's why I think it's also, I mean, it's so nice to talk to you too, because I think we kind of, even though we're both coming from a very similar place, I do think that we balance each other out to a degree. I mean, I tend to be a little bit more cynical than you, definitely, but I think that that's really important, that we're both open to what the other is saying, and exploring different possibilities. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about the point that you made, that we were kind of exploring the other day um, about utopia, and thinking about utopia as like a strategy for, I don't know, for, I guess, for coming up with solutions again for climate change. I mean, rather than thinking about where we don't want to be and the things we want to avoid, and trying to run from those things and avoid those things and escape those things, instead in thinking about what a future looks like that we do want and how to get there. Even though those are literally the same thing, you're just tweaking the language. I think that is much more constructive, because it's like basically it's like you're imagining building something instead of trying to hold up like a building that's burning and crashing. So even though like through that you will also have to acknowledge the things that are going wrong, there's more space, I think, for hopefulness, but like actual hopefulness and constructive hopefulness.
As you were talking there, I got reminded of when we were in 6th grade together, and we had this dystopia unit that was about just dystopian books, but we would read things like Lois Lowry's books, Gathering Blue and The Giver and that sort of thing. But now that came into my mind and I'm thinking about it, in a lot of dystopian literature, the point is that the societies, except for like the protagonists in the books, think of where they're living as a utopia. And then, and then you come to find out, oh, it's actually like evil and crazy. But in those books, very often people were like kind of separated from the natural environment. And if I'm remembering them correctly, and that's just like a really interesting kind of thought to go into right now.
Yeah,
I don't think it's super relevant, but
no, that's true. And I think that in a lot of, I distinctly remember, at least in one of the books, at one point I think the protagonist is running through a forest because they're trying to escape. But it's really brutal. Like, nature is
yeah,
definitely not portrayed as a friend. It's like actively, like, I think they're getting all these cuts on them, and it's like actually a very menacing energy
yeah,
that's happening in the forest. So I mean, whether that's perceived, I guess, by the protagonist because they're so isolated from it their whole lives, that it's like something very scary to them when they do encounter it.
right.
Or
And you don't know how to navigate it because you're so separated from it. I think that's something that's true now. I know a lot of people who say that they don't like nature, that they're afraid of going outside, of exploring the woods, going hiking, rock climbing, that sort of thing.
and I mean that in itself is there have also been studies published on this. Sorry, I wish I could like pull out the facts and like actually give you sources, but I'm speaking about these big studies, but believe me, they exist.
We can link them later,
Okay,
possibly.
there's basically studies coming out about this phenomenon of like people being scared of nature because they either like being scared of nature but also romanticizing nature to such a like strong degree. Like you see now all these people fantasizing about having a cottage in the woods and going back to farming, and both of those are symptoms of like extreme isolation from nature, like basically not having enough exposure to nature. um and I don't know, that's super unhealthy. I think,
Definitely.
I don't know, I've been reading, I don't know, I've been thinking a lot about how that kind of thing can be remediated by starting at a very early age. I think one of the biggest investments you can make is in connecting people when they're very young to nature and instilling a sense of like, I don't know, like feeling protective and prideful about the natural environment where they live. Um, and I think that has to do with language too. I mean, knowing how to talk to kids about nature in a way that they can understand, and teaching them that, I mean, even if they're scared of insects or whatever, maybe they don't want to hold them because they don't like their crawly legs or whatever, but teaching them that even things that they're scared of can still have value and are important and should be preserved and protected. And also, I mean, I do think that if more kids were like able, and obviously this isn't always a choice, like you said, it comes down to a degree to privilege because some people just straight up don't have really access to a lot of natural spaces. But I
Yeah.
mean, I think that if you do, and to the extent if you do, I mean, even if you can just go turn over a rock somewhere and just have a kid hold some worms or get some dirt on their hands, I mean, that kind of exposure from a very young age, especially if you can continue it, I think it it definitely also impacts your perception of the natural world, how you relate to it, and
Definitely.
how important you think it is. I mean, how important you think it is, and also how present it is in your mind, and how much space you have for it in like the things that you think about on a daily basis.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just going back to that article and how it started talking about like this depression and anxiety around ecological things, there's also the environment as a potential help with that issue, because I don't know if you guys have heard about forest bathing, but that's a ancient Japanese practice of going into the forest that is proven to reduce anxiety and to help people connect and feel healthier, both in physical and mental senses. And then there's also studies like that hugging trees can release endorphins and make you happier and things like that. So when we look towards the environment for solutions as well, I think that's where we can really where we can really direct efforts as well, not to think that humans and our creations are going to be the solutions, but rather to look towards, again, I'm just being repetitive at this point, but the natural environment, because I've even read that the easiest way to reduce carbon emissions is to plant more trees and to have more and larger and more protected forests.
Yep. No, totally. And even within the field of human innovation, there's like a whole field that's gaining more and more traction now called biomimicry. And it's essentially that idea. It's like drawing innovation from natural processes that already exist. And the logic is like these are processes that have been perfected through trial and error over the course of millions of billions of years. I mean, like, who are we to reinvent the wheel, essentially? And there's like really, really cool stuff. Like, for example, I think that there was a concrete company that did something with, I mean, they mimicked like coral and how it sequestered carbon, and so now they're either created or are trying to create a cement that essentially sequesters carbon so that you can make buildings that sequester carbon. Or for example, they had studied a beetle, the wing structure of a beetle in the desert, and how it was able to draw moisture out of the air. And they, again, either have or are trying to design a water bottle that's lined with a similar material and is essentially a self-filling water bottle. Like you just leave it out and it collects moisture and fills itself. So I think definitely drawing innovation from nature, and especially not just in like reinventing stuff that draws inspiration from nature, but yeah, if the processes are already there, I mean, like, how can you invent something more perfect than a tree, right? Like it already exists. It's like it sequesters carbon. It's beautiful. The root systems are also so important for like preventing erosion. It's a home for like, it's a haven of biodiversity. I mean, it depends on the tree, but you know what I mean. Like it offers a solution to so many things. So if those already exist, yeah, I mean, trying to preserve the solutions that are already there and just know, kind of just being there to support them and like let them do their thing.
Definitely. I wanted to bring up something related to family homelessness because I can't go a whole class without talking about that one. But this is a post that I made for Earth Day that's from an interview that I'm just wondering if I told my class about this already or not, but either way, it's about to happen again. So I'm going to share my screen for a second to pull up this photo. Okay. So in searching for both preventative and reactive solutions to ending homelessness, we must consider our environment and common home. And this is a quote from Paula Breitstein, who is just a really great environmentalist and scholar from Canada who's currently living in Kenya. And I've had the pleasure to get her inputs on several of my research publications. But here's what she said when I was asking her about how can we look towards the environment for help in solving the homelessness crisis. So she says, there's a lot we could do to meet the culturally diverse needs of groups experiencing homelessness. We need to redesign and reorient our built surroundings, our built environment, in a way that's more human-centered and more community-centered. And if we do that and do it properly, we can do it in a way that's much more environmentally sustainable. You can incorporate various types of food systems and water recycling programs to enable local resourcing of food and water. You can have more trees to be able to support more ecosystem services in and around our built environment. Notably, part of what she's saying here is that it can meet the culturally diverse needs of the groups that are experiencing homelessness. So part of that conversation for us was talking about how in Canada, in Montreal, in certain cities, there's a disproportionate amount of the homeless population that's comprised of Native people. And so in looking for solutions as well, she's saying you have to bring in natural solutions and consider like the culture that's behind those groups. And that's something I've encountered in a lot of this research is trying to bring attention to and also spread some values that in certain mainstream societies we really put aside, such as the value of the environment in our everyday lives and in our even in our living spaces.
Yeah, I really, really like that quote. I mean, first of all, I think I really like the kind of language that she uses, because it's what we were talking about, like using more specific language that really like elicits solid imagery of what you're talking about, instead of kind of like a broad stroke that, you know, could really mean anything and really depends on, I mean, even stuff like sustainability, we've talked about that also in a lot of my classes. It really means such different things to such different people that it's, yeah, when you're painting with such broad strokes, it's hard to really know if you're all on the same page. I mean, you can leave the conversation and all think that you like understood each other, but you all really took away completely different things. And I think that yeah, especially like, I mean, she talks about, you know, she mentions that different groups have different needs. I mean, even that
Yeah.
like basic idea is going to require more specific language to, if you just talk about like global homelessness, it erases so many of the specificities of the problem, and so then yeah, you can't really talk about specific solutions without uh, specifying the problem, and the complexity of the problem. And like, yeah, that's much harder when you like really try to acknowledge the complexity, but that is what we need to do.
Definitely.
And yeah, I was sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say I have no idea how long we've been talking.
Oh, me neither. I think it's been almost an hour.
Okay.
um
I do want to get into talking about like possible solutions a little bit more.
Sure.
Um,
Well, actually, the quote you just read reminded me when she was talking about
yeah.
systems that can be used to address homelessness by kind of sourcing more locally. Um, I can send you. I had completely forgotten about this, but I did like a pretty extensive literature review on like a lot of studies that I found that had been published specifically about um, the positive effects of climate change. Sorry, not of climate change. No,
I was about to be like, wow.
lots of negative effects of climate change. The positive effects of community gardening,
Oh, yeah, please.
specifically the positive effects of community gardening on like people who are already suffering from depression, anxiety, PTSD, different, yeah, just mental illness in general, how it can help to alleviate that, and then also specifically how it can help um, disadvantaged communities, aka, I mean, minority communities in the United States, like more impoverished groups, people who have less access to education, how it can help like kind of combat like childhood obesity because of exposure, like more of a connection with food, understanding where it comes from, how it grows, like being open to like, trying new things, being excited about eating fresh things because
Yeah.
you like personally grew it. Um, so I don't know. I think like for example, I think that's a solution that I found that I'm really passionate about. That I think because it's so like raw, also like you literally it's bringing people together and they're like actively working together with nature. I think it's such a perfect combination of things. Um, and like in that also while they're working, having conversations and like being able to cultivate trust and talking about their experiences. The article found that, I mean, the articles, the different studies found that actually learning to collaborate specifically in things having to do with the garden, like just choosing like, you know, who's going to do the weeding, just stuff like that, that actually helped communities build tools that later helped them address like larger issues in their own communities and be able to work together.
Mm-hmm.
So I see community gardening as like a really exciting place that offers like a whole host of solutions for like isolation that people are feeling, and also like this need to have like better natural spaces. Like if one doesn't exist near you, you know, you can build one. And obviously it's not that easy. Like you need to maybe sometimes get permitting or whatever, but I think or sometimes
But
not.
it's very doable, and I think like for that reason we need to promote that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Also seeing all the intersections with those other problems, and this part of like this comparative politics is to see that things are so interconnected. So yeah, we could look at we could look at community gardening as just one thing on its own and see the benefits of that, but it's better to see it as something that can influence like crime rates, food and nutrition, and like even the psychological realm.
Yeah, and and it's shown that it has. And then like there's more radical versions of that, like guerrilla gardening. There is a guy specifically in Los Angeles, Ron Finley, who was he is this like African American man, and he has been arrested many times for literally for planting like carrots on sidewalk, like in the green strips, like between the road and sidewalks, stuff like that. Like guerrilla gardeners essentially like try to like plant vegetable gardens in medians that just have grass. Like they'll tear out lawn and they'll try to make it edible food. Because I guess that's their idea of utopia, like a world where people can walk around and just pick like a tomato, where we have like food growing all around us and it's not this privatized commodity. But even a small thing like that would make like a difference for homeless people who like have trouble getting fresh food. I mean, even if they just like, it's obviously not going to fix the whole problem, but I think that every little thing helps. I mean, if you were able to like have homeless shelters, have like participate in community gardening, or have like their own community gardening, I think that would
Okay, I really love everything you're saying right now. I have like a lot of ideas now as well.
Well, I would definitely share the study with you just for your own personal reading, or if you want to like include it along with the article. I don't know. Just because I've been talking a lot about these like big studies, and I feel like it'd be helpful if.
Oh no, now they're gonna get a long list of things to look at. Okay. So yeah, no, that's awesome. It also reminds me of I've previously done some work through St. John's with Indigenous communities in Ecuador. These are like collaborative projects that we did there, not coming in to take over anything, but we've learned so much there, like that in their high school in one of these communities, they do gardening during like what we would consider the physical education class, which is so cool. There's a lot of creative ways to go about this, for
That's
sure.
Really cool. I would have much rather been planting carrots than doing whatever we did in physical education.
Well, I took a really amazing dance class in high school. Okay. And when I say amazing, I mean like I'm terrible at dancing. So I should have been gardening. Hold on, I had something I wanted to show people. Yeah, this is regarding water because I think water is relevant as well. I
would say so.
Definitely, with water insecurity is a huge product of the climate crisis as well. So 3 billion people lack access to drinking water that is really safe. 1/5 of the world population lives in areas where water is physically scarce. And they also talk about 1/4 of the world population lives in developing countries that face water shortages due to infrastructure problems and weak governance. So invested in improved water management and services is one way to reduce poverty and achieve sustainable economic growth. And these are kind of some United Nations resources. And then also wanting to say water saving tips for people who want to have a more personal, a better personal output in relationship to the environment. So turning off the water while washing hair, to everything to like, don't fill your swimming pool and use a cover. Not that I have a swimming pool to fill.
But if you did, I think this kind of like messaging is really important. I don't know. I live in California where, you know, we have like, oh, the phone's ringing.
One sec.
Let me just see who that is. All right, they can wait. Anyway,
I'm just here trying to figure out how to pause, but I am technologically incapable of that.
Oh shoot, it's okay. I was gonna say that I live in California where there's like a persistent drought. So there is a lot of messaging, especially in Los Angeles. I've seen just like at bus stops and on benches about conserving water. But I think that, I think it would be awesome to just have that messaging everywhere, because even if you aren't specifically in a drought where you are, I don't know, just having messaging that is kind of constantly reminding you that we're in a crisis, and kind of been thinking about what are the little things that you can do to help, because I'm a big believer in, I think that the little things make a really big difference. I think that outsourcing, I've talked to you about this, I think that outsourcing blame to like corporations and these kind of vague entities, while it is totally valid, because the data shows that, those people are obviously the biggest polluters, but I do think that in order to like address that and dismantle those kinds of systems, people do have an individual responsibility, and I do think that people have power to do that. I think if enough people kind of like do these small little things that maybe seem insignificant, like on these posters, that just reducing your personal consumption is gonna bring down like all these corporate giants that everyone is supposedly railing against, because I think that people have a lot of power with like the money they spend and how they use resources and the demand that they create for resources. And that's not to say that you should be like Chris in the story, and that you necessarily need to like drive yourself crazy and like walk around shirtless and shoeless every day and just eat like foraged fruits and like not use your thermostat if you're cold or whatever.
Even though that is the dream.
Although that is the dream, but I really think it's about finding your own personal. I think it's about honesty. I think this article, if anything, I think is about honesty, like being honest with yourself about how you're feeling, about the things that you know to be true, and about what you personally think that you can do to help, and what you personally want to do to help, because those are two different things. And being honest with yourself about if you aren't doing everything you can do to help, which is fine, I guess. As long as you acknowledge it. And I think it's about that. It's just about honesty and acknowledgement, like both like from an individual level to like a systematic level, that we just need more of that. And in order for that honesty to exist, the language needs to exist.
Thank you so much. I guess my last message as like a teacher of comparative politics is really for my students and for whoever's listening to know that you play a political role in these issues, however small it may be, but there is definitely room to pursue further research, further involvement in causes or initiatives and processes related to the climate and to water security and these other topics we've discussed, and to make a positive contribution there. And even just your awareness and, like Milena has said, like your honesty about what's happening in these issues can really go far.
And I think that this is like, if anything, seeing the silver lining right now is the perfect moment for reflection. Like, we have a pause, and we are dealing with a global pandemic that is bringing to light a lot of issues. And I think this is the perfect time to maybe like let yourself sit with that discomfort, like we said, and really like think through things and come out with a clear understanding of what your understanding is of like the world and where we're at, and like what you want to do or what you can do.
Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for being my
friend. Thank you for that as well. I think this was really valuable for whoever's listening, and I definitely learned a lot in the process as well. So
I hope so.
Yeah, so I'm going to stop recording now, but again, this is Milena Castillo-Grynberg with me here today.
Hi.
And thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.